Welcome to Silent Shadows. In the quiet, affluent enclave of Boulder, Colorado, nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, a chilling mystery began to unfold on Christmas morning, 1996. This is the story of JonBenét Ramsey, a vibrant, captivating 6-year-old whose life, steeped in the glittering world of child beauty pageants, was tragically and abruptly extinguished in the sanctity of her own home. Her death would not only shatter the peace of a holiday morning, but would ignite a media firestorm, captivate a nation, and remain, decades later, one of America's most perplexing unsolved homicides. JonBenét, born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, was the youngest of 2 children born to Patsy and John Ramsey. Her mother, Patsy, a former beauty queen herself, introduced JonBenét to the world of pageants at a young age. With her cherubic face, sparkling eyes, and seemingly effortless grace, JonBenét quickly became a natural, capturing titles like America's Royal Miss, Little Miss Charlevoix, Little Miss Colorado, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl, and National Tiny Miss Beauty. These triumphs painted a public image of a happy, thriving child, a stark contrast to the grim reality that awaited her. The Ramsey family, headed by John Ramsey, a successful businessman and president of Access Graphics, a computer software company, had moved to Boulder in 1991. Their life in Boulder, with its beautiful home at 755 15th Street, seemed the epitome of the American dream. But behind the facade of success and suburban tranquility lay a darkness that would forever link the Ramsey name to tragedy. Christmas Day, 1996, should have been a day of joy and celebration. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare. According to reports, the family had returned home from a Christmas party the previous evening. The morning of December 26th, Patsy Ramsey awoke to find her daughter missing and, on the kitchen staircase, a handwritten ransom note. The note itself was highly unusual, 2.5 pages long, demanding a seemingly specific amount, $118,000. This figure, eerily close to John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from the previous year, immediately raised questions and cast a shadow of suspicion. The note's length and its demand for a specific, relatively small sum struck investigators as odd. FBI agents, called in to assist, noted the rarity of such a lengthy ransom note being composed at the crime scene itself. Adding to the peculiarities, the note was written on a notepad from the Ramsey home, using a pen also found within the house. The note's language, replete with unusual exclamation marks and initialisms like BTC, further fueled suspicions among some investigators. Patsy Ramsey's actions immediately following the discovery of the note also became a point of scrutiny. Despite the note's explicit instructions not to contact the police or friends, Patsy telephoned 911 at 5:52 a.m. MST. She also contacted family and friends, who soon began arriving at the house. 2 police officers responded swiftly to the 911 call, arriving at the Ramsey home within 3 minutes. Their initial, cursory search of the expansive house yielded no signs of forced entry. This absence of a clear break-in point would become a significant factor in the early stages of the investigation, leading some to immediately suspect those inside the home. One officer, Rick French, descended into the basement. He came across a door secured by a wooden latch at the top of the frame. He paused, considering it, but ultimately moved on without opening it. His reasoning, explained later, was that he was looking for an exit route used by a potential kidnapper. Since the latch was secured from the inside, he reasoned, a perpetrator couldn't have used this door to leave and then resecured it from within. This seemingly logical deduction, however, would prove tragically incorrect. JonBenét's body was later discovered behind that very door. In the initial chaotic hours, operating under the assumption that this was a kidnapping, the police made critical errors that would severely compromise the crime scene. Only JonBenét's bedroom was cordoned off, in an attempt to preserve potential evidence related to a kidnapping. The rest of the sprawling house, however, was not secured. As friends, family, and victim advocates arrived to offer support, they unknowingly and inadvertently contaminated the scene. Surfaces were touched, items were moved, and the integrity of the potential crime scene was irrevocably compromised. This lack of immediate and complete lockdown of the entire house would be a point of heavy criticism against the Boulder police in the years that followed. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at the home around 8 a.m. MST, anticipating further instructions from the supposed kidnappers. However, the call never came. As the hours stretched on with no contact, the situation grew increasingly tense. Around 1 p.m., MST, Detective Arndt made a fateful decision. She asked John Ramsey and a family friend, Fleet White, to conduct their own search of the house to see if anything seemed amiss. They began their search in the basement. It was John Ramsey who opened the latch door that Officer French had overlooked. And it was there, in a small room in the basement, that the horrifying truth was discovered. JonBenét's lifeless body lay there. Her mouth was covered with duct tape. A nylon cord was found around her wrists and neck. A white blanket covered her torso. In a moment of understandable, though critically damaging, instinct, John Ramsey picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs. This action, while born of a father's anguish, further disturbed the already compromised crime scene, potentially destroying vital forensic evidence. The forensics team, who had initially focused on a kidnapping scenario, now had a homicide on their hands, with a significantly contaminated scene to process. The discovery of JonBenét's body shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. The initial theory of a kidnapping quickly dissolved, replaced by the grim reality of a murder within the home. The presence of a lengthy, unusual ransom note, the lack of forced entry, and the compromised crime scene immediately placed the Ramsey family under intense scrutiny. In the immediate aftermath, the Ramseys provided handwriting, blood, and hair samples to the police. John and Patsy participated in a preliminary interview, and their son Burke, who was 9 years old at the time, was also interviewed within the first couple of weeks. However, their level of cooperation, or perceived lack thereof, would become a major point of contention between the Ramseys and the police, further complicating an already complex investigation. The Ramseys, through their attorneys, stated their reluctance stemmed from a fear that the police were fixated on them and would not adequately pursue the possibility of an intruder. This tension between the family and law enforcement would persist for years, fueling speculation and hindering the investigation. The autopsy report delivered a stark and brutal confirmation of the violence JonBenet had suffered. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. She had sustained a fractured skull, and the nylon cord found around her neck had been used as a garrote. While there was no definitive evidence of conventional rape, the autopsy could not rule out sexual assault. There was evidence of a vaginal injury, and disturbingly, evidence suggesting the paintbrush handle used in the garrote might also have been used in a sexual assault. The pathologist also noted that JonBenét's vaginal area appeared to have been wiped with a cloth. Her death was unequivocally ruled a homicide. Adding another layer to the mystery, the autopsy revealed the presence of vegetable or fruit material which may represent pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, indicating she had eaten it just a few hours before her death. Photographs taken in the Ramsey home on the day the body was found showed a bowl of pineapple on the kitchen table with a spoon in it. However, neither John nor Patsy recalled putting the bowl out or feeding JonBenet pineapple. Later, police reported finding Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints on the bowl, a detail that would add to the complex web of circumstantial evidence. The garrote itself was a crude but effective weapon, fashioned from a length of nylon cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush. Part of the bristle end of the paintbrush was found in a tub of Patsy's art supplies, but the crucial bottom third of the handle was never located, despite extensive searches of the house. This missing piece added another puzzle to the already fragmented picture. The initial investigation was plagued by errors and missteps, stemming in part from the initial belief it was a kidnapping and the subsequent contamination of the crime scene. The police force, reportedly lacking extensive experience in handling such a high-profile and complex case, also faced criticism for sharing evidence with the Ramseys and delaying formal, recorded interviews with the parents. These early challenges created an uphill battle for investigators and fueled public and media speculation. The case quickly became a national sensation, amplified by JonBenét's involvement in child beauty pageants and the Ramsey family's wealth. The media coverage was intense, often speculative, and at times sensational. The focus on the pageant world, with its perceived glamour and potential underbelly, captivated the public imagination. The wealth of the Ramseys, and the contrast between their privileged lifestyle and the brutal nature of the crime, further fueled the narrative. The media's intense focus and the leaks of information, sometimes intentionally by the police to pressure the Ramseys, created a circus-like atmosphere around the investigation. Amidst the media frenzy and the struggling investigation, two primary opposing theories began to take shape: the family member theory and the intruder theory. Each had its proponents and its own set of compelling, yet ultimately inconclusive, evidence. The truth, buried beneath layers of speculation, missteps, and unanswered questions, remained elusive, turning the JonBenét Ramsey case into an enduring symbol of unsolved crime and the complexities of seeking justice. The immediate aftermath of finding JonBenét's body plunged the investigation into a state of intense pressure and conflicting perspectives. With the tragic reality of a homicide confirmed, the Boulder Police Department faced the monumental task of identifying her killer. Almost immediately, the focus began to narrow, and the spotlight turned inward, towards the very people who should have been her protectors, her family. The rationale behind this initial focus on the Ramseys wasn't arbitrary. As chilling as it is to consider, statistical data in child homicides often points towards a family member or caregiver being involved. Greg McCrary, a retired FBI profiler, noted the stark statistic: a 12-to-1 probability that the perpetrator in such cases is someone known to the child, likely within the family unit. This statistical likelihood, combined with the peculiar circumstances of the crime scene, heavily influenced the early direction of the Boulder police investigation. Key among these peculiar circumstances was the striking absence of any definitive sign of forced entry into the Ramsey home. Windows were checked, doors were examined, but investigators could not find a clear point where an intruder might have gained access. In a case initially reported as a kidnapping, the lack of a forced entry suggested to many that the crime must have originated from within. Then there was the ransom note. Its very existence, while seemingly supporting a kidnapping scenario, contained elements that struck investigators as highly suspicious. The length of the note, 2.5 pages, was seen as unusual for a genuine kidnapping. Typically, ransom notes are brief and to the point, designed for quick delivery and minimal risk to the perpetrator. The time taken to compose such a lengthy note at the scene of the crime seemed improbable to seasoned investigators. The fact that it was written on a notepad and with a pen from the Ramsey home further fueled suspicions that the note was staged, an elaborate attempt to mislead investigators and fabricate a kidnapping narrative. The amount demanded, $118,000, was another perplexing detail. While a specific sum might seem plausible in a ransom demand, John Ramsey's observation that it was nearly identical to his previous year's Christmas bonus was highly suggestive. This detail, he pointed out to the police early on, could indicate someone with inside knowledge of the family's finances. Investigators explored this angle, considering employees at Access Graphics who might have been privy to John's bonus information. They even delved into religious interpretations, considering whether the sum might be a reference to Psalm 118. The sheer specificity, yet seemingly personal connection to the family's finances, made the demand feel less like a random act of extortion and more like something deeply intertwined with the victims themselves. The language and style of the note also drew scrutiny. The unusual use of exclamation marks and initialisms, like SBTC, prompted linguistic analysis. Experts debated the possible origins and intent behind these stylistic choices. Some theories even suggested the note echoed dialogue from films, pointing to potential sources like Ruthless People, Ransom, Escape from New York, Speed, and Dirty Harry. This theatricality, combined with the note's other peculiarities, further solidified the belief among some that the note was a carefully crafted fabrication designed to create the illusion of an outside perpetrator. Perhaps one of the most damning pieces of evidence regarding the ransom note, at least in the initial stages, was the analysis of fingerprints found on it. While Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints were present, as would be expected from someone who handled the note, the absence of other fingerprints was notable. The police believed this absence, particularly of fingerprints from an unknown individual, supported the staging theory. However, the legal proceedings and subsequent analyses would introduce complexities to this interpretation, with some experts arguing that the lack of other prints wasn't conclusive proof of staging. A Colorado Bureau of Investigation (CBI) report, based on handwriting analysis, indicated indications that the author of the ransom note is Patricia Ramsey. This preliminary finding, though not a definitive conclusion, weighed heavily on the minds of investigators. Forensic pathologist Michael Bodden, who consulted on the case, remarked that in his 60 years of experience, he had never encountered a ransom note like it, and he didn't believe it was written by an outside stranger. However, it is crucial to note that subsequent analysis and legal rulings would challenge the certainty of Patsy Ramsey being the author. A federal court, citing the opinions of 6 certified handwriting experts, later ruled it highly unlikely that Patsy wrote the note. This conflicting expert testimony highlights the inherent difficulties and subjective nature of handwriting analysis, particularly when dealing with a potential staging scenario where the author might attempt to disguise their writing. The court even lamented the presence of self-proclaimed, uncredentialed experts who publicly accused Patsy without scientific basis, underscoring the harmful influence of unqualified opinions in such a high-profile case. The note's authenticity, and therefore its implications for the case, would remain a fiercely debated topic. Beyond the peculiarities of the crime scene and the ransom note, the behavior of the Ramseys in the immediate aftermath also became a point of intense focus and criticism. Their decision to call friends and family in addition to the police, their initial reluctance to submit to formal police interviews without their attorneys present, and their decision to hire a public relations firm were all interpreted by some, including elements within law enforcement, as indicative of guilt or at least a lack of full cooperation. Governor Bill Owens of Colorado publicly urged the Ramseys to quit hiding behind their attorneys, quit hiding behind their PR firm, reflecting a widespread public sentiment that their actions were hindering the investigation. The Ramseys, however, maintained that their cautious approach was a direct result of their fear that the police had unfairly fixated on them as suspects from the outset and were not adequately investigating the possibility of an intruder. They argued that they were trying to protect themselves and their surviving son, Burke, from what they perceived as a biased and potentially wrongful accusation. The initial interviews with John and Patsy were described as preliminary and relatively brief, lasting just over 2 hours. Burke was also interviewed within the first 2 weeks. While these initial interactions occurred, the lack of immediate, in-depth, and recorded interviews with the parents was later criticized as a significant error. This delay, coupled with the presence of friends and family in the home during the critical early hours, further complicated the ability of investigators to gather uncontaminated information and observations. The crime scene contamination was another critical failure that would haunt the investigation. The decision to only cordon off JonBenet's bedroom, based on the initial kidnapping assumption, meant that the rest of the house, where crucial evidence might have been present, was not preserved. As people moved freely through the home, they inadvertently disturbed potential evidence, from fingerprints to fibers to trace DNA. The image of visitors cleaning surfaces in the kitchen, potentially wiping away vital clues, is a stark reminder of the consequences of not securing the entire scene from the outset. This early period of the investigation was marked by a palpable tension between the police and the Ramsey family, as well as internal disagreements within law enforcement itself. The Boulder police, operating under pressure and influenced by the statistical likelihood of a family perpetrator and the peculiar scene details, initially leaned heavily towards the family member theory. This created a deep rift with those who felt the intruder theory was not being adequately explored. The intense media coverage, fueled by leaks and speculation, added another layer of complexity. The Ramseys' participation in televised interviews, while attempting to plead their innocence and appeal for help in finding the killer, also subjected them to public scrutiny and judgment. Their every word and action were dissected and interpreted, often through the lens of suspicion already cast upon them. In this environment of suspicion and conflicting theories, the stage was set for a prolonged and contentious investigation. The early missteps, the intense media glare, and the deep division between those who suspected the family and those who believed an intruder was responsible would turn the JonBenét Ramsey case into a Gordian knot, seemingly impossible to untangle. The foundation of the investigation, compromised from the start, would make the path to justice incredibly challenging, leaving a community and a nation grappling with unanswered questions and the enduring mystery of who killed JonBenét Ramsey. As the initial shock and chaos subsided, the JonBenét Ramsey investigation settled into a deeply polarized state, dominated by two competing theories, the family member theory and the intruder theory. These two narratives, each with its staunch proponents and specific interpretations of the evidence, would clash repeatedly, contributing to the case's enduring lack of resolution. The family member theory, as we discussed, was the initial focus of the Boulder police. Their reasoning was rooted in statistical likelihood and the absence of clear forced entry. The peculiar ransom note, written on materials from the house and demanding an amount tied to John Ramsey's bonus, screamed inside job to many seasoned officers. The perceived lack of full cooperation from the Ramseys, their delay in submitting to formal interviews, and their hiring of a PR firm further solidified suspicions in the minds of some investigators. Within this theory, various scenarios were quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, discussed. One prevalent idea was that Patsy Ramsey, perhaps in a fit of rage over something like a bedwetting incident, had struck JonBenét, and then, a panic, orchestrated the elaborate staging of a kidnapping to cover up the accidental or perhaps intended killing. The autopsy finding of a skull fracture, in addition to the strangulation, lent some weight to the idea of an initial blow. Proponents of this theory pointed to Patsy's background as a pageant mother, suggesting the pressure and intensity of that world might have contributed to a moment of uncontrolled anger. However, those who knew Patsy often countered this, describing her as a loving, devoted mother with no history of violence or uncontrollable temper. JonBenét's brother, Burke, years later, would emphatically deny any notion of violence in their home, stating they weren't even spanked, let alone subjected to physical harm. Another facet of the family member theory sometimes included the possibility of Burke's involvement. At 9 years old at the time, some speculated that he might have accidentally caused his sister's death, perhaps in a sibling altercation, and that the parents then covered it up to protect him. This scenario gained traction in certain media portrayals and discussions, particularly those focusing on the pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach and a potential conflict over it. However, Burke was interviewed multiple times by investigators, and child psychologists who reviewed these interviews found no indication of his involvement. Both the police and the district attorney's office publicly stated that Burke was not a suspect. Despite these official statements, speculation about Burke's potential, albeit unintentional, role has persisted in some corners of public discourse. The strangulation itself, in the context of the family theory, was sometimes viewed as a potential red herring, a deliberate act designed to make the death look like the work of a deranged intruder, thereby concealing the true circumstances of the assault and killing, which might have involved an initial blow or another form of harm. The complex knot of the garrote, the use of the paintbrush handle, and the duct tape all contributed to the image of a meticulously staged scene, intended to deflect suspicion from within the household. The intruder theory presented a vastly different narrative. Proponents of this theory argued that despite the lack of obvious forced entry, a skilled perpetrator could have gained access to the home unnoticed. They pointed to potential vulnerabilities, such as windows left slightly ajar for Christmas lights, a broken basement window, or an unlocked door. While the police initially downplayed these possibilities, focusing on the lack of clear signs of forced entry, proponents of the intruder theory argued that this simply meant the entry method was subtle or expertly concealed. A key figure championing the intruder theory was Detective Lou Smith. Smith, a seasoned detective who came out of retirement to assist the Boulder County District Attorney's Office in 1997, became a vocal advocate for the idea that an outside killer was responsible. Smith meticulously examined the evidence, focusing on details that he believed pointed away from the family. He highlighted the presence of an unidentified boot mark in the basement room where JonBenét's body was found, suggesting a foreign presence. He also pointed to potential entry points that he felt the police had not adequately considered or investigated. Smith's theory proposed that an intruder entered the Ramsey home, perhaps through the broken basement window, subdued JonBenét, possibly using a stun gun. Some early reports mentioned marks that could be consistent with a stun gun, although this was never definitively proven. Took her to the basement, killed her, and then staged the scene, including writing the ransom note to mislead investigators. The fact that the note was written on materials from the house, in this theory, could be explained by a perpetrator who improvised after finding themselves unexpectedly in a kidnapping/murder scenario. Critics of Smith's broken window theory pointed to the presence of intact cobwebs around the window and the steel grate covering it, as well as undisturbed foliage outside. They argued that if someone had climbed through, these delicate indicators would have been disturbed. Smith countered that a careful intruder could have avoided disturbing the cobwebs, or that the cobwebs might not have been as undisturbed as initially claimed. The debate over the broken window became a microcosm of the larger conflict between the two theories, with each side interpreting the same evidence through their own lens. Adding weight to the intruder theory was the sheer number of burglaries that had occurred in the Ramseys' affluent neighborhood in the months leading up to the murder. This suggested a vulnerability to outside criminal activity. Furthermore, the presence of registered sex offenders living within a 2-mile radius of the Ramsey home raised concerns about potential perpetrators in the area. In 2001, former Boulder County Prosecutor Trip Demuth and Sheriff's Detective Steve Ainsworth publicly stated their belief that the intruder theory warranted a more aggressive investigation. The conflict between the family member theory and the intruder theory wasn't just an academic debate. It created a deep schism within the investigation itself. The Boulder police, largely focused on the family, clashed repeatedly with the district attorney's office, which, particularly under the leadership of Mary Lacey later on, became more open to and eventually championed the intruder theory. This animosity and lack of a unified front hampered the investigation and fueled public mistrust. Detective Steve Thomas, One of the lead police investigators, who strongly favored the family member theory, became increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as interference from the DA's office. He eventually resigned, believing the office was undermining his hypothesis and failing to support his efforts to build a case against the Ramseys. Conversely, Lou Smith resigned from the official investigation, feeling that the police were too fixated on the family and were incompetently overlooking the compelling evidence supporting the intruder hypothesis. Even after resigning, Smith continued to investigate the case independently until his death in 2010, steadfast in his belief that an intruder was the killer. The internal turmoil and lack of progress prompted Colorado Governor Roy Romer to intervene, naming Michael Caine as a special prosecutor to oversee the case and potentially initiate a grand jury. A grand jury was indeed convened in September 1998 to consider indicting the Ramseys. After months of presentations of evidence, the grand jury returned a true bill in October 1999 recommending charges against the Ramseys. The indictment reportedly cited 2 counts each of child abuse, alleging the parents recklessly placed JonBenét in a threatening situation that resulted in her death. However, the grand jury's decision was based on a probable cause standard, which is lower than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required for a criminal conviction. Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter, despite the grand jury's recommendation, made the controversial decision not to sign the indictment or prosecute the Ramseys. He stated that he did not believe there was sufficient evidence to meet the higher burden of proof required for a successful criminal trial. This decision was met with public outcry and further fueled the perception that the Ramseys had somehow escaped justice. The public remained largely unaware of the grand jury's specific recommendation until sealed court documents were released years later in 2013. The differing opinions, internal conflicts, and the grand jury's inconclusive outcome left the JonBenét Ramsey case in a state of limbo. The initial momentum had been lost, the crime scene was compromised, and the key players were divided by their adherence to opposing theories. The stage was set for years of continued speculation, media sensationalism, and a lingering sense of injustice, as the question of who killed JonBenét Ramsey remained, and largely still remains, unanswered. The decision by District Attorney Alex Hunter not to prosecute the Ramseys in 1999, despite the grand jury's recommendation, left the case in a state of unresolved tension. For years, the specter of suspicion continued to hang over the family, fueled by intense media scrutiny and a public deeply divided on their guilt or innocence. However, a new era for the investigation began in December 2002, when Mary Lacy took over as the Boulder County District Attorney. Lacy's tenure marked a significant shift in the official handling of the case. Unlike her predecessor and many within the Boulder Police Department, Lacy appeared more receptive to the intruder theory. This inclination became evident in April 2003 when she publicly agreed with a federal judge's assessment in a 2002 libel case, stating that the evidence presented was more consistent with a theory that an intruder murdered JonBenét than it was with a theory that Mrs. Ramsey did. This alignment with the intruder hypothesis signaled a departure from the primary focus on the family that had characterized the initial years of the investigation. But the most significant development under Lacy's leadership, and perhaps the most pivotal turn in the entire investigation since the discovery of JonBenét's body, came in December 2003. Forensic investigators, utilizing increasingly sophisticated techniques, were able to extract enough material from a mixed blood sample found on JonBenét's underwear to establish a DNA profile. This was a monumental step. For years, the hope of finding conclusive DNA evidence had been a driving force, a potential key to unlocking the mystery. The results of the DNA analysis sent shockwaves through the case. The DNA belonged to an unknown male. Crucially, the DNA profiles of John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey were all excluded from this match. This male DNA, a potential biological fingerprint of the killer, was submitted to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a vast database containing millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and forensic samples. The hope was that this unknown male profile would match an existing entry, potentially identifying the perpetrator and finally bringing resolution to the case. However, the sample did not match any profile in the database. The killer, if this DNA belonged to them, was not in the system. Despite the lack of an immediate match, the discovery of this unknown male DNA was seen by many as a powerful piece of evidence supporting the intruder theory. If the DNA was indeed from the perpetrator, and it wasn't from anyone in the Ramsey family, then logically, the killer must have been someone from outside the home. Building on this development, in July 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office, under Mary Lacy, made a dramatic announcement. Citing newly developed DNA sampling and testing techniques, specifically touch DNA analysis, which can detect microscopic traces of DNA left behind by simple contact, Lacy declared that the Ramsey family members were excluded as suspects in the case. In a move that generated significant controversy, Mary Lacy publicly exonerated the Ramseys, sending them a letter of apology. This official declaration from the district attorney's office was a major vindication for the Ramseys, who had lived under a cloud of suspicion for over a decade. For many, it finally closed the door on the family member theory and firmly pointed towards an intruder. However, the significance and conclusiveness of the DNA evidence, and Lacy's subsequent exoneration of the Ramseys, were not universally accepted within the law enforcement community. Differing opinions among experts and investigators continued to fuel debate. Former Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner, who had been heavily involved in the initial investigation that focused on the family, publicly disagreed with Lacy's exoneration. In 2015, he stated that exonerating anyone based on a small piece of evidence that has not yet been proved to even be connected to the crime is absurd. Beckner argued that while the unknown DNA was important, its presence alone didn't definitively rule out the possibility of the Ramseys' involvement or fully support an intruder theory without further context or corroboration. He maintained that the DNA, until proven otherwise, had to be the focus, and the suspect was the source of that unknown DNA, but he questioned whether that source necessarily meant an intruder acted alone or that the family was completely uninvolved in the events leading to the DNA being left behind. Adding to the complexity, a report in October 2016 revealed that new forensic analysis, using even more sensitive techniques, indicated that the original DNA sample might have contained genetic markers from two individuals other than JonBenét. This raised the possibility of a mixed profile, potentially complicating the interpretation of the DNA evidence and suggesting the presence of more than one unknown person. James Kohler, a lead investigator for the DA's office under a later administration, also raised questions about the DNA evidence presented by Lacy. He claimed that there were additional traces of male DNA found on the cord and paintbrush used in the garage that Mary Lacy had not mentioned publicly. Kohler suggested that test results had found 6 separate DNA samples belonging to unknown individuals. If true, this would paint a picture of a more complex scene than initially presented, potentially involving multiple unknown individuals. Despite these complexities, some experts strongly believed the DNA pointed unequivocally to the killer. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong expressed the view that the DNA, appearing identically in several different places on multiple surfaces, belonged to the perpetrator. Former Adams County, Colorado, District Attorney Bob Grant, who assisted the Boulder DA's office on the case for years, also considered the DNA evidence highly significant, stating that any resolution of the case would need to explain how this DNA ended up on several pieces of JonBenét's clothing. Conversely, forensic pathologist Michael Bodden, while acknowledging the presence of the unknown DNA, offered a cautionary perspective. He stated that trace amounts of DNA can get on places and clothing from all different, non-suspicious means. He emphasized that the mere presence of touched DNA doesn't automatically equate to direct involvement in the crime, and that there was no forensic evidence definitively proving this was a stranger murder based solely on the DNA. This highlights the ongoing debate about the interpretation of touch DNA, whether it represents direct contact during the crime or could have been transferred innocently through secondary means. The public exoneration by Mary Lacy, while providing some relief to the Ramseys, also created friction with law enforcement officials who felt the investigation was being prematurely closed or misdirected. Stephen E. Pitt, a forensic psychiatrist hired by Boulder authorities, described Lacy's exoneration as a big slap in the face to Chief Beckner and the core group of detectives who had been working on the case for years, highlighting the deep divide that persisted. Gordon Coombs, a former investigator for the Boulder County District Attorney's Office under Lacy, also questioned the total absolution of the Ramseys based solely on touch DNA, especially given the initial contamination of the crime scene. He suggested that Lacy strongly favored the intruder theory and that there was pressure within the office not to voice opposition to it. In February 2009, a significant shift occurred again. Stan Garnett, the new Boulder County District Attorney, turned the case back over to the Boulder Police Department, signaling a renewed commitment from the police to actively investigate the cold case. The statute of limitations had by then expired on the child abuse charges recommended by the 1999 grand jury, meaning even if the evidence against the Ramseys on those specific charges were revisited, prosecution would no longer be possible. In October 2010, the Boulder police officially reopened the cold case. New interviews were conducted, and the police stated their intention to utilize the latest DNA technology in their renewed efforts. However, reports indicated that these new interviews did not yield significant new information. As of September 2016 and continuing to the present day, the JonBenét Ramsey case remains an active homicide investigation with the Boulder Police Department. They publish annual updates on their website, indicating that the case is still being pursued, albeit as a challenging cold case. The journey through the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, from the initial frantic moments to the complexities of DNA evidence and the differing opinions of those involved, underscores the immense challenges in solving a crime where the initial response is flawed and the evidence open to multiple interpretations. The unknown male DNA remains a critical piece of the puzzle, offering a potential path to identifying the killer, yet its significance and the circumstances of its deposition continue to be debated. Decades later, the case remains a haunting reminder of a young life tragically lost and a mystery that continues to elude definitive answers, leaving the door open to continued speculation and the hope that future forensic advancements might one day finally reveal the truth. Beyond the confines of the Ramsey home and the Boulder Police Department, the JonBenét Ramsey case exploded onto the national and international stage, transforming from a local tragedy into a global media phenomenon. The captivating yet unsettling image of a child beauty queen brutally murdered in her seemingly perfect home seized the public imagination and refused to let go. This intense media glare, while keeping the case in the public consciousness, also profoundly impacted the investigation and the lives of those connected to it, often hindering more than helping the pursuit of justice. The media coverage was relentless, often sensational, and deeply divisive. Early reports frequently highlighted JonBenét's brief but prominent career in child beauty pageants, painting a picture that both fascinated and disturbed the public. The stark contrast between the glitz and glamour of the pageant world and the brutal reality of her death created a compelling, albeit unsettling, narrative. Patsy Ramsey's own history as a former beauty queen and her enthusiastic involvement in JonBenét's pageants became a central part of the story, leading to intense scrutiny of her parenting and character. The term pageant mother took on a new, often negative, connotation in the public discourse surrounding the case. The wealth of the Ramsey family also became a major focal point. Their large home, their privileged lifestyle, and John Ramsey's success as a businessman were constantly juxtaposed with the crime, fueling public fascination and, in some cases, resentment. The media's focus on these aspects often overshadowed the complex and often contradictory nature of the actual evidence, contributing to a narrative that was more about the perceived character of the family than the facts of the case. Speculation ran rampant, and various media outlets, particularly tabloids, were quick to point fingers and assign blame. The lack of a clear perpetrator and the unusual circumstances of the crime created a vacuum that was quickly filled by conjecture and rumor. Both the family member theory and the intruder theory were dissected and debated endlessly in print and on television, often without the full context or nuance of the actual investigation. This intense public trial by media created a climate of suspicion that was incredibly difficult for the Ramseys and others involved to navigate. The media's handling of the case was not without its consequences. Ramsey family members and their friends, finding themselves under intense scrutiny and facing damaging accusations, began to fight back through the legal system. Defamation lawsuits became a significant, albeit parallel, battleground to the criminal investigation. L. Linwood, an attorney specializing in libel cases, represented the Ramsey family in numerous defamation suits. Starting in 1999, the family sued Star Magazine and its parent company, American Media, Inc., on behalf of their son, Burke, seeking to protect his reputation from harmful and, they argued, false accusations. This was just the beginning. Defamation suits were filed against a variety of media organizations and individuals whose reporting or commentary they believed had falsely implicated them in the murder. Authors and publishers were also targeted. In 2001, a defamation suit was filed against the authors and publisher of the book JonBenét, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, which reportedly presented a case heavily leaning towards the family member theory. This suit was eventually settled out of court, illustrating the legal risks associated with publishing definitive conclusions about an ongoing, unresolved investigation. Even anonymous internet users found themselves facing legal action. In a notable instance in November 2006, A friend of John Ramsey, Rod Westmoreland, filed a defamation suit against an anonymous web surfer using the pseudonym Unraveling, who had posted messages on online forums implicating Westmoreland in the murder. This highlighted the challenges and complexities of dealing with potentially defamatory statements made in the relatively unmoderated space of the early internet. The Ramseys themselves also faced defamation lawsuits stemming from their own book, The Death of Innocence, published in 2001. These suits were brought by individuals mentioned in the book who claimed they were falsely portrayed as suspects by the Boulder police. Represented by Lynn Wood and other attorneys, the Ramseys successfully defended themselves against these lawsuits, ultimately obtaining their dismissal. It was in one of these cases that U.S. District Court Judge Julie Carnes made her notable finding that abundant evidence in the murder case pointed to an intruder having committed the crime, a ruling that would be cited by proponents of the intruder theory. The legal battles extended even to television dramatizations and documentaries. In a September 2016 interview and documentary television program, forensic pathologist Werner Spitz publicly accused Burke Ramsey of killing his sister. Burke and his attorneys swiftly responded, filing a defamation lawsuit against Spitz seeking significant damages. This was followed by another major lawsuit in December 2016, in which Burke Ramsey's lawyers filed a civil suit accusing CBS, the production company, and several experts featured in the case of JonBenét Ramsey documentary of defamation of character, seeking hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. While CBS initially sought to dismiss the suit, a judge denied their motion, allowing the case to proceed. This high-profile legal battle eventually ended in a settlement to the satisfaction of all parties in January 2019, the terms of which were not publicly disclosed. These lawsuits are the significant personal and financial cost of the intense public scrutiny and accusations surrounding the case. Adding another strange twist to the already convoluted case was the false confession of John Mark Carr. In August 2006, Carr, a schoolteacher, was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, after claiming responsibility for JonBenét's murder. Carr's confession, which included claims of drugging and sexually assaulting JonBenét before accidentally killing her, briefly reignited hope that the case was solved. However, his confession quickly began to unravel. Carr's account contained only basic facts about the case, information that was widely available in the public domain. He failed to provide convincing details that only the true perpetrator would know. Furthermore, his claim that JonBenét was drugged was directly contradicted by the autopsy report, which found no drugs in her system. The most conclusive blow to his confession came when his DNA was tested, and compared to the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's body, there was no match. Authorities also found no other evidence linking Carr to the crime scene in Boulder. His confession was definitively disproved, adding another layer of bizarre complexity to a case already steeped in it. Carr's false confession served as a stark reminder of the dangers of individuals seeking notoriety by confessing to famous crimes and the importance of verifying confessions with concrete evidence. Decades after JonBenét's death, the case continues to hold a morbid fascination for the public. It has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, television shows, and even fictionalized dramatizations. These portrayals, while keeping the case in the public eye, often rehashed the same conflicting theories and evidence, sometimes presenting them with a definitive slant, much to the frustration of those still hoping for a genuine breakthrough. JonBenét herself, frozen in time as the smiling child in her pageant photographs, has become a tragic icon, her image instantly recognizable and forever linked to the unsolved mystery of her death. The intense media coverage, the proliferation of theories, the legal battles, and the bizarre false confession of John Mark Carr have all contributed to the complex and often distorted public perception of the JonBenét Ramsey case. While the official investigation remains open, the sheer volume of external noise and conflicting narratives makes the path to finding the truth incredibly challenging. The case stands as a powerful example of how a high-profile crime can be shaped and, in some ways, obscured by the relentless glare of the media and the court of public opinion. While the dramatic twists of DNA evidence and the media frenzy often captured headlines, the bedrock of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, particularly in its early stages, lay in the painstaking examination of the physical evidence found within the seemingly ordinary suburban home. Each object, each detail, held the potential to speak volumes, yet in this confounding case, the silence often proved deafening or perhaps deliberately misleading. As investigators delved into the scene, the very items meant to provide clarity became points of intense contention, interpreted through the conflicting lenses of the family member and intruder theories. Consider, for instance, the chilling instrument of JonBenét's death, the garrote. This crude but effective weapon, fashioned from a length of nylon cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush, was found tied around her neck. The materials themselves were mundane items likely found within any household. Proponents of the family member theory saw this as significant. The use of readily available household items to construct the murder weapon suggested an impulsive act, a crime of opportunity committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the home and its contents. The fact that part of the bristle end of the paintbrush was later found in Patsy Ramsey's art supplies further fueled this line of reasoning, implying the weapon's components originated from within the house. However, proponents of the intruder theory offered a different interpretation. They argued that an intruder, finding themselves in an unexpected situation, might improvise a weapon from whatever materials were at hand. A length of cord and a sturdy object like a paintbrush handle could easily be grabbed in a moment of panic or necessity. The missing bottom third of the paintbrush handle, never located despite extensive searches, was seen by some as a piece the intruder might have taken with them, either intentionally or inadvertently. The garrote, in this view, was not necessarily evidence of an inside job, but rather a sign of a perpetrator adapting to the circumstances they encountered. The presence of duct tape covering JonBenét's mouth also offered ambiguous clues. Duct tape is a common item, easily found in many homes. Its use could be interpreted in multiple ways: by a family member attempting to silence the child after an injury or during an argument, or by an intruder seeking to prevent screams and facilitate control. The specific brand or characteristics of the duct tape, if they could have been identified, might have offered more definitive answers, but in the absence of such clarity, the duct tape remained a piece of evidence that could fit into either narrative. The basement, where JonBenét's body was ultimately discovered, held several crucial pieces of physical evidence that were central to the intruder theory, yet also debated fiercely. One such piece was the unidentified boot print found in the concrete floor of the wine cellar room where her body was located. To those who believed an intruder was responsible, this boot print was compelling evidence of an outside presence, a mark left behind by the killer during the commission of the crime. It was a tangible sign that someone unknown had been in that specific, secluded area of the house. However, the interpretation of the boot print wasn't straightforward. Questions arose about its clarity, whether it could be definitively linked to a specific type of boot, and whether it could have been made by someone who legitimately had reason to be in the basement at some point. Without a matching boot or further corroborating evidence, the boot print, while suggestive, remained open to alternative explanations or questions about its relevance. Another piece of evidence frequently cited by intruder theorists was the condition of the basement windows and doors. While the initial police search found no obvious signs of forced entry, proponents of the intruder theory pointed to potential vulnerabilities. The text mentions 2 windows left slightly open to accommodate electrical cords for Christmas lights, a broken basement window, and an unlocked door. Lou Smith, in particular, focused on the broken basement window as a likely point of entry. His theory was that a perpetrator could have gained access through this window, but this too was contested. Critics of the broken window theory, including elements within the police department, highlighted the presence of intact cobwebs around the window frame and grate, and undisturbed foliage outside. They argued that someone entering through this window would inevitably have disturbed these delicate natural elements. Smith and his supporters countered by suggesting a nimble intruder could have avoided the cobwebs or that their condition wasn't as pristine as claimed. The debate over the state of the cobwebs became a minor but persistent point of contention, symbolizing the larger struggle to definitively prove or disprove an intrusion. The lack of a clearly forced entry point remained a strong argument for those who suspected the crime originated within the home. The presence of pineapple in JonBenét's stomach contents, discovered during the autopsy, also became a piece of physical evidence subject to intense scrutiny and differing interpretations. The autopsy report noted vegetable or fruit material which may represent pineapple, indicating she had eaten it a few hours before her death. Photographs from the house showed a bowl of pineapple with a spoon on the kitchen table. The fact that neither John nor Patsy recalled giving JonBenét pineapple that evening struck investigators as unusual. Patsy's fingerprints were reportedly found on the bowl. For those leaning towards the family member theory, the pineapple was potentially a key piece of evidence. Some speculated that a conflict over the pineapple might have been the catalyst for the initial injury, perhaps an argument with a sibling or a frustrated parent. The presence of Patsy's fingerprints on the bowl could link her directly to the last food JonBenet consumed. The Ramseys' lack of recollection about the pineapple was viewed by some as evasiveness or a sign of a deliberate attempt to conceal the events of the evening. However, the pineapple evidence was not conclusive proof of a family member's guilt. It's possible JonBenét helped herself to the pineapple, or that someone else in the family gave it to her without it being a particularly memorable event for the parents amidst the activities of Christmas evening. The interpretation of the pineapple evidence, like so many other details in this case, became a matter of perspective and what narrative the interpreter was trying to build. Even the overall condition of the crime scene, particularly the initial failure to secure the entire house, became a piece of negative evidence, highlighting the challenges faced by the investigation. The contamination that occurred before the forensics team could properly process the scene meant that potential physical evidence of trace fibers, fingerprints, hairs, or other microscopic clues could have been inadvertently destroyed or introduced by well-meaning friends and family. This failure made it exponentially more difficult to definitively link any physical evidence found to a specific individual, whether family member or intruder. In essence, the physical evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case did not provide a clear, unambiguous path to the truth. Each piece, from the garrote to the boot print to the pineapple, was a puzzle piece that could seemingly fit into more than one picture. The differing interpretations of this evidence, often fueled by pre-existing biases or adherence to a particular theory, contributed significantly to the prolonged nature of the investigation and the inability to reach a consensus. The physical remnants of that tragic Christmas night remained, and still remain, silent witnesses whose testimony is subject to the ongoing, unresolved debate over who killed JonBenét Ramsey. In the unfolding drama of the JonBenét Ramsey case, the individuals at its center, both victims and investigators, became figures of intense public scrutiny and, at times, controversy. Their personalities, decisions, and conflicting perspectives didn't just shape the course of the investigation. They became integral parts of the tragic narrative itself. The human element, with its inherent biases, pressures, and deeply held beliefs, proved to be as complex and challenging to unravel as the physical evidence left at the crime scene. At the very heart of the case were John and Patsy Ramsey. Thrust into the unbearable tragedy of losing their daughter under horrifying circumstances, they also found themselves at the epicenter of a storm of suspicion. Their every action, every public statement, every facial expression was dissected and interpreted by a voracious media and a captivated public. Patsy, with her background as a beauty queen and her emotional public appearances, and John, with his business acumen and seemingly reserved demeanor, were held up to intense scrutiny. Their decision to hire legal counsel and a public relations firm early on, while a standard practice for those facing potential legal issues, was viewed by some as a sign of guilt, an attempt to control the narrative rather than fully cooperate with the police. The tension between the Ramseys and the Boulder Police Department was palpable from the outset and would fester for years. The police, influenced by the statistical likelihood of familial involvement in child homicides and the peculiar aspects of the crime scene like the lack of forced entry and the staged ransom note, initially focused heavily on the family. This early suspicion, whether justified or not, created a deep distrust between the Ramseys and the lead investigators. The Ramseys, in turn, expressed fear that the police had tunnel vision and were not adequately pursuing the possibility of an intruder, leading to their cautious approach to interviews and their decision to hire private investigators and legal teams. This adversarial relationship, sadly, likely hindered the free flow of information and cooperation that is crucial in the critical early stages of any investigation. Within the law enforcement and legal communities involved in the case, deeply rooted divisions emerged, largely centered around the competing family member and intruder theories. Two figures, in particular, came to embody this conflict: Detective Steve Thomas of the Boulder Police Department and Detective Lou Smith, who joined the case assisting the district attorney's office. Steve Thomas was a prominent voice within the Boulder police who firmly believed the evidence pointed to the family's involvement. He was deeply committed to this theory and became increasingly frustrated with what he saw as obstacles placed in his path. The perceived lack of full cooperation from the Ramseys and the differing views within the DA's office fueled his conviction and his frustrations. Thomas eventually resigned from the police department, feeling that his efforts to pursue the family member theory were not being adequately supported and that the investigation was being mishandled. His subsequent book on the case further articulated his strong belief in the Ramseys' guilt. Lou Smith, on the other hand, became a passionate advocate for the intruder theory. Drawing on his extensive experience as a homicide detective, Smith meticulously examined the crime scene and the evidence, identifying details that he believed were inconsistent with a crime committed by a family member and strongly suggestive of an outside perpetrator. He focused on evidence like the potential entry points, the boot print, and other subtle clues he felt were being overlooked by the police due to their focus on the family. Smith's conviction in the intruder theory was so strong that he too resigned from the official investigation when he felt his perspective was not being taken seriously by the police. He continued to investigate the case independently until his death, driven by his unwavering belief that the truth lay in finding the unknown intruder. The clash between Thomas and Smith, two experienced detectives with opposing views, perfectly encapsulated the fundamental disagreement that plagued the investigation. The district attorney's office also saw shifts in perspective that impacted the case. Under Alex Hunter, the office presented evidence to a grand jury, which recommended indicting the Ramseys on child abuse charges. However, Hunter ultimately declined to prosecute, stating insufficient evidence to meet the higher burden of proof for a criminal conviction. This decision, while legally defensible, was met with significant public criticism and further fueled the perception of a potential cover-up or a failure to hold the family accountable. When Mary Lacy took over as district attorney, the shift towards the intruder theory became more pronounced. Lacy's public statements, and most significantly, the office's exoneration of the Ramseys in 2008 based on the unknown male DNA, solidified this change in direction. Lacy's strong stance in favor of the intruder theory, while welcomed by the Ramseys and their supporters, was met with skepticism and frustration by many within the Boulder Police Department, including former Chief Mark Beckner. Beckner publicly questioned the definitive nature of the exoneration based on limited DNA evidence, highlighting the ongoing disagreement between the police and the DA's office even after more than a decade. The internal conflicts were not limited to the high-profile figures. Garden Coombs, an investigator who worked in the DA's office under Mary Lacy, later spoke about the atmosphere within the office, suggesting a strong bias towards the intruder theory and pressure not to voice dissenting opinions. This paints a picture of an investigation not always guided solely by objective evidence, but also influenced by personalities, political pressures, and firmly held beliefs. The involvement of experts from various fields, forensic pathologists, DNA specialists, handwriting analysts, criminal profilers, also introduced differing opinions and interpretations. While these experts were brought in to provide objective analysis, their findings were sometimes contradictory or open to multiple interpretations, adding further layers of complexity and debate to the case. For example, the conflicting opinions on the handwriting analysis of the ransom note or the interpretation of the unknown male DNA illustrate how even scientific evidence can be subject to different conclusions depending on the expert and the methodology used. Even individuals on the periphery, like neighbor Bill McReynolds, who was initially considered a person of interest partly due to his Santa Claus appearance and a poem he wrote, found their lives impacted by the intense scrutiny. The wide net cast by investigators and the media's focus meant that even tangential connections or coincidences could draw unwanted attention and suspicion. The human element in the JonBenét Ramsey case, the grief of the parents, the dedication and frustrations of the investigators, the differing perspectives of legal officials, and the intrusion of public opinion and media narratives created a volatile mix that profoundly impacted the search for truth. The conflicts between individuals and agencies, fueled by differing interpretations of the evidence and perhaps by the sheer pressure of such a high-profile case, made an already challenging investigation exponentially more difficult. Decades later, understanding these human dynamics is crucial to appreciating why the case remains unsolved, a stark reminder that crime investigations are not just about collecting evidence, but also about navigating the complex and often flawed landscape of human interaction and perception. Among the many unsettling elements of the JonBenét Ramsey case, the ransom note stands out as one of the most bizarre and debated pieces of evidence. Its discovery on the morning of December 26, 1996, initially framed the events as a kidnapping. Yet, the note itself, with its unusual length, specific demands, and peculiar language, quickly became a central pillar for the theory that the crime scene had been meticulously staged to mislead investigators. Patsy Ramsey reported finding the 2.5-page handwritten note on the kitchen staircase. Its presence immediately shifted the family's focus from a missing child to a potential abduction for ransom. But as investigators began to analyze the note's content and characteristics, red flags began to emerge, pointing away from a typical kidnapping scenario and towards something far more complex and potentially sinister. The sheer length of the note was one of the first anomalies. At 2.5 pages, It was unusually verbose for a ransom demand. Seasoned investigators, including those from the FBI who were consulted on the case, noted that authentic ransom notes are typically brief and functional, designed for quick composition and minimal risk to the perpetrator. The time and effort required to write such a lengthy note at the scene of the crime seemed improbable for a genuine kidnapper operating under pressure. This suggested to some that the author felt comfortable and had ample time within the house to compose their elaborate message. The note's content itself was filled with peculiar phrasing and dramatic language. It purported to be from a small foreign faction that respected John Ramsey's business but not the country it served. This attempt to inject a political or international motive into the crime struck many as forced and theatrical. The specific demand of $118,000 was another point of intense scrutiny, particularly after John Ramsey pointed out its proximity to his recent Christmas bonus amount. This detail strongly suggested that the author had inside knowledge of the Ramsey family's finances, an unlikely characteristic for a random foreign faction or a typical intruder. The threats contained within the note were chillingly specific and dramatic. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You will also be denied her remains for proper burial. The warning against contacting authorities was equally stark. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as police, FBI, etc., will result in your daughter being beheaded. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. These over-the-top, almost cinematic threats, combined with the seemingly random reference to a stray dog, contributed to the impression among investigators that the note was not a genuine communication from hardened criminals, but rather a fabricated message. The sign-off, "Victory," followed by the enigmatic initialism as BTC, added another layer of mystery and speculation. The meaning of BTC has never been definitively determined, despite numerous theories. Its inclusion felt less like a criminal signature and more like a cryptic flourish, further supporting the idea of a staged, theatrical production. Investigators also noted the unusual use of exclamation marks and other stylistic quirks throughout the note. These linguistic anomalies, combined with the note's content and length, led some handwriting analysts, including those from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, to conclude that there were indications that the author of the ransom note is Patricia Ramsey. While this was not a definitive conclusion, it aligned with the growing suspicion among many within the Boulder police that the note was written by someone within the household, likely Patsy, in an attempt to create a false narrative. The theory that the ransom note echoed dialogue from films further reinforced the idea of staging and a theatrical mindset. The text mentions that investigators considered films like Ruthless People, Ransom, Escape from New York, Speed, and Dirty Harry as potential sources for phrases or themes used in the note. If the author was indeed borrowing lines or concepts from movies, it would strongly suggest a deliberate effort to construct a fictional scenario rather than communicate genuinely with the victim's family. This aspect of the note added another layer to the staging theory, suggesting the perpetrator was not a hardened criminal but perhaps someone influenced by fictional portrayals of crime. The fact that the note was written on a notepad found in the Ramsey home and with a pen from the house was another crucial piece of evidence supporting the staging hypothesis. Why would an intruder arrive at a wealthy home planning a kidnapping without bringing their own writing materials? The use of items readily available within the house strongly suggested to investigators that the author was already inside the home and had easy access to these supplies. This detail was a powerful argument against the idea of an outside perpetrator who had broken into the house solely for the purpose of a kidnapping. The ransom note, with all its peculiarities, became the central piece of evidence supporting the broader theory of staging. Investigators began to look at other aspects of the crime scene through this lens, interpreting various details as further attempts to create the illusion of an intruder and a kidnapping gone wrong. The lack of any discernible forced entry was a major factor. If the note claimed the child had been kidnapped, where was the evidence of a break-in? The absence of a kicked-in door, a forced window, or other signs of a struggle to gain entry contradicted the narrative presented in the note and fueled the belief that the perpetrator was already inside the house. The way JonBenét's body was found also contributed to the staging theory. The presence of the garrote, the duct tape, and the blanket covering her torso were seen by some as deliberate attempts to make the scene appear more dramatic and consistent with a violent abduction and murder by a stranger. The use of the garrote, in particular, was seen by some as an unusual method of killing for a crime that might have originated from a domestic incident. Furthermore, the location where the body was found in the basement, An area not immediately obvious to a casual observer and behind a latch door could be interpreted as an attempt to conceal the body for a period of time, perhaps while the staging of the kidnapping note was completed or while the perpetrators decided on their next steps. If a kidnapping had truly occurred, why hide the body within the house after writing a ransom note demanding her return? This seemed illogical to investigators and further suggested a staged event designed to misdirect them. The sum of these elements, the unusual ransom note written on internal materials, the lack of forced entry, and the manner and location of the body's discovery, coalesced into the powerful theory that the entire scene had been staged. This staging theory became the dominant perspective for many within the Boulder Police Department and heavily influenced their initial focus on the Ramsey family. They believed that someone within the household had killed JonBenét and then created the elaborate scenario to make it look like an outsider was responsible, thereby diverting suspicion from themselves. However, it is crucial to remember that the staging theory, while compelling to many investigators, was based on interpretations of circumstantial evidence. Proponents of the intruder theory offered alternative explanations for these same details, as we've discussed. The debate over whether the scene was staged, and by whom, remains a central, unresolved question in the JonBenét Ramsey case, highlighting the inherent difficulty in deciphering intent and truth from a complex and compromised crime scene. The ransom note, a bizarre artifact of that tragic morning, continues to be a key piece of this enduring puzzle, its true meaning perhaps forever lost in the shadows of an unsolved crime. While the intense focus on the Ramsey family often dominated headlines and internal police discussions, the possibility of an outside intruder, a stranger who breached the sanctity of their home on Christmas night, remained a persistent, and for some, a more plausible explanation for JonBenét's murder. Early in the investigation, even as suspicion circled the Ramseys, investigators cast a wider net, identifying numerous individuals who, for various reasons, became persons of interest in the case. These potential intruders, though many were eventually cleared, represent the very real, albeit unproven, possibility that a predator from outside the family circle was responsible for this horrific crime. The Boulder police reportedly compiled a list of over 1,600 people in their index of persons of interest by October 1997, illustrating the breadth of their initial, though perhaps not consistently pursued, search for suspects beyond the immediate family. Among these individuals, several names have surfaced in public discussions and in the provided text, representing different potential avenues of investigation under the intruder theory. One early person of interest mentioned is neighbor Bill McReynolds. McReynolds, known to the Ramsey family and who sometimes played Santa Claus at local events, drew attention partly due to a rather eerie poem he had reportedly given the Ramseys after JonBenét's death, which some interpreted as having disturbing undertones. His access to the family and his somewhat unusual behavior brought him under scrutiny. However, like many others on the vast list, McReynolds was reportedly investigated and ultimately not linked conclusively to the crime. His inclusion as a person of interest highlights how proximity and seemingly odd behavior, in the context of a high-profile unsolved murder, could quickly draw the attention of investigators and the media. Another individual who briefly fell under suspicion was Chris Wolf, a local reporter. The text notes that Wolf's then-girlfriend reported him as a suspect, although the reasons for her suspicion aren't detailed in the provided information. The fact that a personal relationship could lead to someone being flagged as a potential suspect underscores the complex web of connections and accusations that can emerge in such cases. Without further information in the text about the specifics of the allegations or the outcome of the investigation into Wolf, he remains a name on the list of those considered, reflecting the wide, and at times seemingly disparate, range of individuals who came under the investigative microscope. The family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, was also reportedly considered as a person of interest. As someone who had regular access to the Ramsey home, she possessed inside knowledge that a random intruder would not. The text doesn't provide details on why she specifically drew suspicion beyond her employment by the family. However, individuals with access to the home are often routinely investigated in cases of this nature, particularly when the possibility of an inside job is being considered. Her inclusion highlights the necessary due diligence of looking at anyone with legitimate access to the crime scene. A more intriguing and, for some, a more sinister potential intruder mentioned in the text is Michael Helguth. Helguth, who reportedly died in an apparent suicide shortly after JonBenét's death, was a figure who surfaced in various theories and discussions related to the case. The text's brief mention of his death shortly after the murder is tantalizing but lacks detail about why he was considered a suspect in the first place or what evidence, if any, ever linked him to the crime. The timing of his death, however, adds a layer of tragic coincidence or potential significance depending on one's perspective on the case. Without more information in the provided text, Helgath remains a mysterious figure on the periphery of the investigation, a potential lead that was seemingly cut short. Perhaps one of the most significant potential intruder suspects to emerge later in the case was Gary Howard Oliva. Oliva, described as a registered sex offender, was publicly identified as a suspect in a 2002 television program and was later arrested in 2016 on unrelated charges of attempted sexual exploitation of a child. Lou Smith reportedly identified Oliva as a suspect. The fact that Oliva had a history as a registered sex offender and was arrested on child exploitation charges years later fits a disturbing profile that some believe could be consistent with the perpetrator of JonBenét's murder. His presence in the area and his criminal history made him a compelling figure for those pursuing the intruder theory. However, the provided text does not state that Oliva was ever definitively linked to the JonBenét Ramsey case through DNA or other conclusive evidence, despite being identified as a suspect by some. The investigation into these and other potential intruder suspects faced significant challenges. Without a clear point of forced entry or eyewitness accounts of an intruder, linking an outside individual to the crime scene was incredibly difficult. The compromised nature of the crime scene in the critical early hours also meant that potential forensic evidence left by an intruder could have been lost or contaminated, making it harder to find definitive links. Furthermore, the intense focus on the family by many within the lead investigative agency may have diverted resources and attention that could have been dedicated to thoroughly exploring every potential outside lead. The emergence of the unknown male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing, while a powerful piece of evidence supporting the concept of an unknown male perpetrator, did not immediately identify that individual. This meant that while the DNA excluded the Ramseys, it didn't automatically confirm that one of the previously considered persons of interest, like those mentioned, was the source. The DNA profile needed to match a profile in the CODIS database or be linked through other investigative means. Despite the challenges, the continued efforts to identify the source of the unknown DNA and the ongoing nature of the cold case investigation suggest that the possibility of an intruder has never been completely abandoned by law enforcement. The hope remains that advancements in DNA technology, or new information coming to light, could one day definitively identify the unknown male and potentially link him to one of the individuals previously considered or to someone entirely new. The exploration of potential intruder suspects in the JonBenét Ramsey case underscores the complexity of the investigation and the persistent questions that surround it. While some within law enforcement and the public remained convinced of the family's involvement, the existence of a list of outside persons of interest and the specific individuals who drew suspicion serves as a constant reminder that the possibility of a stranger entering the Ramsey home on that fateful Christmas night remains a very real, albeit as yet unproven, scenario in this enduring American mystery. To truly grasp the disorienting nature of the JonBenét Ramsey case, we must return to that fateful Christmas night and the hours that followed, piecing together a timeline from the fragmented accounts and evidence. This timeline, though seemingly straightforward in its sequence of events, is punctuated by crucial moments and unsettling details that continue to fuel debate and raise questions about what truly transpired within the walls of 755 15th Street. Interwoven with this chronology are the stark and disturbing findings of the autopsy, the medical examiner's crucial contribution to understanding the violence that ended JonBenét's young life. The evening of December 25, 1996, began, according to reports, with the Ramsey family attending a Christmas party at the home of friends. The provided text does not specify the exact time they returned home, but it is understood to have been late in the evening. This period, after their return and before the events of the following morning, remains a critical window of time, the stage upon which the as yet unknown tragedy unfolded. According to one neighbor, Scott Gibbons, around midnight, while looking from his kitchen window, he observed lights on in the upper kitchen of the Ramsey residence, described as dimmed. This observation, while seemingly innocuous, became a point of interest for investigators attempting to reconstruct the timeline of activity within the house during the crucial overnight hours. Was this normal activity? Or did it indicate something unusual was happening? Another neighbor, Melody Stanton, reported being awoken shortly after midnight by the sound of a child's scream coming from the Ramsey home. This report, if accurate and indeed from JonBenét, could suggest the time around which the initial attack or critical event occurred. However, the reliability and interpretation of such a fleeting sound, particularly in the dead of night, are subject to question. Was it a scream of fear, pain, or something else entirely? This reported sound remains a chilling but unconfirmed potential marker in the timeline. The next definitive event, according to the provided text, occurred the following morning, December 26, at 5:52 a.m. MST. This is when Patsy Ramsey made the 911 call to the police, reporting her daughter missing and stating she had found a ransom note. This call marked the official beginning of the police investigation and brought the outside world crashing into the Ramseys' private nightmare. Within 3 minutes of Patsy's call, 2 police officers arrived at the Ramsey home. Their immediate task was to conduct a cursory search for the missing child and for any signs of forced entry by a potential kidnapper. As we've discussed, this initial search, while rapid, was not a full crime scene lockdown, a critical error that would have lasting repercussions. Officer Rick French's brief foray into the basement, his pause at the latch door, and his decision not to open it based on his assumption about an intruder's exit, is a poignant moment in this early timeline, a missed opportunity that delayed the discovery of JonBenét's body. Following the initial police arrival, friends, family members, victim advocates, and the family's minister began arriving at the Ramsey home called by Patsy. The text highlights that this influx of people, while offering support, also contributed to the contamination of the potential crime scene as individuals moved about the house, touched surfaces, and even cleaned in the kitchen. This period between the police arrival and the discovery of the body was critical as the scene's integrity was unknowingly being compromised. Hours passed with the assumption still being that JonBenét had been kidnapped and that contact from the ransom note's author was imminent. John Ramsey began making arrangements to pay the demanded $118,000. A forensics team was dispatched, but initially focused their efforts based on a kidnapping scenario, primarily examining JonBenét's bedroom as the most likely area of interest. Then, around 1 p.m. MST, approximately 7 hours after JonBenét was reported missing, Detective Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White to search the house to see if anything seemed amiss. This was the moment the timeline took its most tragic turn. John Ramsey and Fleet White began their search in the basement. It was John who opened the latched door in the wine cellar area that Officer French had previously overlooked. And it was there that JonBenét's body was found. John Ramsey's immediate, instinctual reaction was to pick up his daughter's body and carry her upstairs. While an emotionally understandable action for a father discovering his child, this further disturbed the scene, potentially altering the position of the body and disturbing crucial evidence before the forensics team had fully processed the area. The time of the body's discovery, around 1 p.m., marked the grim transition from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. The timeline now shifts to the medical examiner's office, where the autopsy was performed, providing vital information about how JonBenéт died and the nature of the violence inflicted upon her. The autopsy report concluded that JonBenét was killed by asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. This meant her death was caused by both strangulation and a skull fracture. The presence of a skull fracture indicated she had suffered a significant blow to the head, in addition to being strangled with a garrote. This finding immediately raised questions. Did the blow precede the strangulation? Was it the intended cause of death, or was the strangulation a secondary act? Proponents of the family member theory sometimes speculated that the blow was an initial, possibly accidental, injury that the strangulation was intended to cover up. Proponents of the intruder theory might suggest the blow was used to subdue her. The autopsy also revealed evidence related to potential sexual assault. While there was no evidence of conventional rape, the report noted a vaginal injury, and the pathologist could not rule out sexual assault. Disturbingly, the report mentioned evidence suggesting the paintbrush handle used in the garrote might also have been used for sexual assault. Furthermore, at the time of the autopsy, the pathologist recorded that it appeared JonBenét's vaginal area had been wiped with a cloth. This detail was particularly disturbing, suggesting a potential attempt to remove evidence of sexual assault. For those supporting the intruder theory, these findings strongly suggested a sexually motivated crime committed by an outside predator. For those considering the possibility of familial involvement and staging, the sexual assault aspect, or evidence thereof, could be interpreted differently, perhaps an attempt to make the crime look like a stranger abduction and sexual assault. The presence of vegetable or fruit material which may represent pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, indicating she had eaten it a few hours before her death, fits into the timeline of her last known activities. As discussed, the discovery of a bowl of pineapple in the kitchen with Patsy's fingerprints on it became a minor but debated piece of circumstantial evidence within the timeline. The combination of the timeline, the unknown activities during the overnight hours, the delayed discovery, and the compromised scene with the brutal findings of the autopsy, the combination of strangulation and a skull fracture, and the evidence of potential sexual assault and wiping created a complex and deeply disturbing picture. Each element, viewed independently or together, offered clues, but these clues could be interpreted in multiple ways, supporting conflicting narratives. The timeline highlights the critical hours that remain shrouded in mystery, while the autopsy findings reveal the horrific nature of the crime itself, providing a stark contrast to the innocent life that was taken. Decades later, investigators continue to revisit this timeline and the autopsy findings, hoping that new forensic techniques or a fresh perspective might shed light on the sequence of events and the full extent of the violence JonBenét endured. The initial hours after the crime were chaotic and marred by missteps, making the reconstruction of a definitive timeline challenging. Yet, understanding the sequence of events, as much as it can be pieced together from the evidence, remains crucial to understanding this complex and tragic case. In the quest for justice, the legal system plays a pivotal role, acting as the framework within which evidence is presented, suspects are considered, and decisions about culpability are made. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, the legal process, far from providing clear answers, added layers of complexity and frustration, highlighting the inherent challenges of applying legal standards to a deeply ambiguous set of circumstances. The decisions made within the legal system, from convening a grand jury to declining prosecution, profoundly impacted the trajectory of the investigation and contributed to the case's enduring cold status. Following the initial investigation, marked by conflicting theories and internal disagreements, the decision was made to convene a grand jury in September 1998. A grand jury is a group of citizens assembled to review evidence in a potential criminal case to determine if there is enough evidence to formally accuse someone of a crime to issue an indictment. The standard of proof required for a grand jury to return an indictment is probable cause. This is a lower standard than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is required for a criminal conviction at trial. Probable cause means there is a reasonable belief that a crime has been committed and that the person accused committed it. For over a year, the grand jury heard evidence presented by the prosecution, examining the details of the crime, the forensic findings available at the time, the peculiar ransom note, and the statements and actions of the Ramsey family and others. The focus, particularly in the presentation from the police's perspective, leaned heavily towards the family member theory. In October 1999, the grand jury returned a true bill, meaning they voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey. The indictment reportedly recommended charging them with 2 counts each of child abuse, specifically for unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation that posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey. This grand jury decision sent shockwaves through the public. For many, it seemed to confirm suspicions of the Ramseys' involvement. However, the grand jury's vote was a recommendation to charge based on probable cause, not a conviction. The ultimate decision to pursue criminal charges rested with the district attorney. Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter faced a monumental decision. Despite the grand jury's indictment, Hunter ultimately chose not to sign the indictment or prosecute John and Patsy Ramsey. His reasoning, explained publicly, was that he did not believe there was sufficient evidence to meet the higher legal standard required for a criminal conviction at trial. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This standard means that the prosecution must present evidence so convincing that there is no other logical explanation based on the facts, except that the defendant committed the crime. Hunter concluded that the evidence available to him at the time, while perhaps suggestive, was not strong enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt of the Ramseys' guilt in causing JonBenét's death. Hunter's decision was highly controversial and met with significant public and media criticism. Many felt that he had failed to pursue justice for JonBenét and that the Ramseys had, in essence, gotten away with murder. However, legal experts noted that a grand jury indictment is not a guarantee of a successful prosecution, and a responsible prosecutor must assess whether they can actually win a conviction at trial based on the available evidence and the required burden of proof. The conflicting interpretations of the evidence, the problems with the crime scene, and the lack of a clear, undeniable narrative likely contributed to Hunter's assessment that a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt would be incredibly difficult to achieve. Adding another layer to the legal complexities, the charges recommended by the grand jury had a statute of limitations. A statute of limitations is a law that sets the maximum time after an event within which legal proceedings may be initiated. For the specific child abuse charges the grand jury recommended, the statute of limitations eventually expired. Stan Garnett, who became Boulder County District Attorney later, found that the statute of limitations for these crimes had passed, meaning that even if new evidence related to those specific charges against the Ramseys emerged, they could no longer be prosecuted for them based on the 1999 indictment. This legal technicality effectively closed one potential avenue for legal action related to the grand jury's findings. With no criminal charges brought against the Ramseys and the statute of limitations expired on the recommended charges, the case transitioned into the frustrating realm of cold cases. A cold case is generally defined as a crime that has not yet been solved and is no longer being actively investigated, though it remains open to future review and potential prosecution if new evidence emerges. The JonBenét Ramsey case, as confirmed by the Boulder Police Department, remains an active, though cold, investigation. Solving a cold case, particularly one as complex and aged as JonBenét's, presents unique and formidable challenges. One of the primary difficulties is the passage of time itself. Evidence can degrade or be lost. The compromised nature of the original crime scene in the Ramsey home, where potential evidence was disturbed before it could be properly documented and collected, is a significant handicap decades later. Witnesses' memories can fade or become distorted over time. People move, making them difficult to locate and re-interview. Some witnesses may have passed away, taking their potential knowledge with them. The initial intense media coverage and the proliferation of theories and speculation can also contaminate memories, making it difficult to discern what a witness actually saw or heard versus what they absorbed from news reports or public discussions. Physical evidence, while potentially holding the key, also faces challenges with age. While DNA technology has advanced significantly, allowing for testing of even trace amounts, the quality and quantity of the original samples are crucial. Degraded DNA or limited samples can still pose obstacles to obtaining a full profile or a definitive match. New technologies offer hope, but they cannot overcome the limitations imposed by a compromised or poorly preserved original scene. Furthermore, the intense public scrutiny and the deep-seated opinions that have formed around the JonBenét Ramsey case over the decades can create challenges for any potential future legal proceedings. Finding an impartial jury, free from preconceived notions about the case, would be a significant hurdle. The court of public opinion has long been in session for this case, making a fair trial in a court of law incredibly difficult. Despite these significant challenges, the case remains open. The Boulder Police Department provides annual updates, stating their continued commitment to finding JonBenét's killer. The hope, as mentioned in the provided text, lies significantly in the potential of new DNA technology. More advanced techniques may be able to extract more information from existing samples or identify connections previously impossible. However, without a match in the DNA databases or a significant break in the case through other means, the unknown male DNA remains a tantalizing clue that has yet to unlock the mystery. The legal journey of the JonBenét Ramsey case, from the grand jury indictment to the decision not to prosecute and the expiration of the statute of limitations, underscores the limitations of the justice system when faced with ambiguous evidence and a deeply flawed initial investigation. The case's status as an enduring cold case highlights the immense difficulties in overcoming the passage of time and the challenges of a compromised scene. While the legal avenues explored thus far have not led to a conviction, the case remains a powerful reminder of a life lost and the persistent, albeit challenging, pursuit of justice in the face of unresolved questions. In the absence of a clear suspect and definitive evidence, investigators in complex cases often turn to the field of psychological profiling. This technique involves analyzing the details of a crime scene to infer characteristics of the unknown perpetrator, including their motivations, behaviors, and potential demographics. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, with its perplexing mix of seemingly contradictory clues, psychological profiling was undoubtedly employed, offering insights that sometimes aligned with existing theories and at other times introduced new dimensions to the mystery. Criminal profilers examine various aspects of a crime: the nature of the victim, the location of the crime, the weapon used, the method of killing, any attempts at staging or cleanup, to create a behavioral and psychological portrait of the offender. Their goal is to help investigators understand the why and the who behind the crime, even when the suspect's identity is unknown. In JonBenét's case, profilers would have meticulously examined the autopsy findings. The fact that she suffered both strangulation and a skull fracture, often referred to as overkill when more force or methods are used than necessary to cause death, could suggest intense emotion or rage on the part of the perpetrator. The combination of injuries might also indicate a chaotic or unplanned attack, where the initial method wasn't immediately effective, leading to the use of another. The evidence of potential sexual assault, including the vaginal injury and the possible use of the paintbrush handle, would be a critical factor in profiling. Crimes with a sexual component often suggest specific motivations and psychological pathologies. The apparent wiping of the vaginal area could indicate an attempt to remove forensic evidence, suggesting some level of criminal sophistication or panic on the part of the offender. Profilers would consider whether the sexual aspect was the primary motive or a component of a broader attack. The staging of the scene, if accepted as genuine by the profiler, would be a major indicator of offender characteristics. An elaborately staged scene, including a lengthy and peculiar ransom note, often points towards an organized offender. Organized offenders are typically intelligent, socially capable, and plan their crimes. They are often meticulous in their attempts to control the crime scene and mislead investigators. The details of the ransom note, its specific demands, its bizarre language, its potential allusions to films, could be analyzed for clues about the author's personality, intelligence, and potential grievances. The use of household items in the staging could suggest familiarity with the environment, potentially pointing back to an insider. Conversely, if a profiler leaned towards a disorganized offender profile, they might interpret the scene differently. Disorganized offenders are typically less intelligent, socially awkward, and commit crimes impulsively. Their crime scenes are often chaotic, with little attempt at cleanup or staging. While aspects of the Ramsey crime scene, like the elaborate note, seem inconsistent with a purely disorganized offender, some elements could be interpreted as impulsive acts within a larger, perhaps unplanned, event. For example, the initial blow causing the skull fracture might be seen as an impulsive act of violence, followed by a panicked attempt to cover it up through strangulation and staging. Profilers would also consider the weapon used. The improvised nature of the garrote, made from common household items, could be interpreted in different ways depending on the profile. An organized offender might improvise a weapon if their planned method failed or if the opportunity arose unexpectedly. A disorganized offender might grab whatever is readily available in a moment of impulse. The presence of the unknown male DNA, while not providing a profile in the traditional sense of behavioral characteristics, presents a crucial piece of biological evidence that profilers would need to integrate into their assessment. If this DNA is definitively linked to the perpetrator, it confirms the presence of an unknown male at the scene. Profilers might then try to reconcile the characteristics suggested by the crime scene analysis with the fact that an unknown male was present. Does the crime scene suggest an organized offender who was also an unknown male? Or does it suggest a disorganized offender who happened to be an unknown male? Or does the unknown DNA challenge the initial profiling conclusions about the offender's characteristics? The differing interpretations of the DNA evidence by experts, as mentioned in the text, also impact the profiling process. If, as some experts like Candace DeLong and Bob Grant suggest, the DNA is a strong indicator of the killer, profilers would lean towards a profile consistent with an unknown male perpetrator. If, as Michael Bodden and Garden Coombs suggest, the trace DNA could have been transferred innocently, profilers would have to be more cautious in using the DNA as a definitive anchor for their profile and continue to consider other possibilities. The psychological profile developed in a case like this is not a definitive identification tool, but rather a guide for investigators. It can help narrow down the pool of potential suspects by suggesting characteristics to look for. It can also provide insights into how the perpetrator might behave after the crime, such as whether they are likely to reoffend or discuss the crime with others. However, profiling has its limitations. It is based on inferences and patterns, and individual behavior can deviate from typical profiles. The ambiguity of the evidence in the Ramsey case makes it particularly challenging for profilers, as different interpretations of the same details can lead to vastly different conclusions about the perpetrator's characteristics. Was the crime scene meticulously staged by a cunning insider, or was it a chaotic attempt at cover-up by someone less sophisticated? Was the motivation primarily sexual, or was the sexual assault a component of another motive? These are the types of questions profilers would grapple with and their answers would heavily influence the portrait they create. The psychological aspects of the JonBenét Ramsey case extend beyond just profiling the perpetrator. The intense media scrutiny and public speculation also created a unique psychological environment for the family, the investigators, and the community. The pressure to solve the case, the conflicting theories, and the constant public debate undoubtedly took a toll on everyone involved. Ultimately, while psychological profiling can offer valuable insights and help guide an investigation in a case as complex and ambiguous as JonBenét's, it is unlikely to provide the definitive answer needed for a conviction. The differing interpretations of the evidence mean that a universally accepted profile of the killer has never emerged, leaving investigators and the public to grapple with multiple possibilities and the lingering question of who, based on their actions and motivations, could have committed such a crime. In the wake of any major crime, the actions of law enforcement in the critical first hours are paramount. The initial response sets the tone, secures the scene, and can either preserve vital evidence or inadvertently compromise the entire investigation. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, while the tragedy of a child's murder was undeniably the primary focus, the handling of the scene by the Boulder Police Department in those crucial early moments became a major source of controversy and, according to many critics, significantly hampered the ability to definitively solve the crime. The provided text outlines several key errors that were made, issues that would echo throughout the ensuing decades and contribute to the frustrating lack of resolution. Perhaps the most widely cited and criticized error was the failure to properly secure and preserve the crime scene from the outset, leading to significant contamination. When Patsy Ramsey called 911 reporting a kidnapping, the initial assumption shaped the police response. Their primary focus was on finding the missing child and determining how a kidnapper might have entered and exited the house. Based on this assumption, only JonBenét's bedroom was initially cordoned off, intended to preserve it as the potential starting point of an abduction. However, the rest of the sprawling Ramsey home was not treated as a potential crime scene. As friends, family, and victim advocates arrived at the house, offering support to the distressed Ramseys, they were allowed to move freely throughout the home. This influx of people, while undoubtedly well-intentioned, unknowingly compromised the integrity of the scene. The text mentions visitors picking up and cleaning surfaces in the kitchen, a seemingly innocent act of helpfulness that could have destroyed crucial evidence like fingerprints, fibers, or trace DNA left by a perpetrator. Every person who entered the house, every surface they touched, every object they moved, potentially introduced new evidence or destroyed existing clues, muddying the waters for forensic analysis. The discovery of JonBenét's body in the basement hours later dramatically changed the nature of the investigation from a kidnapping to a homicide. But by then, the scene had already been significantly compromised. The area where her body was found, the wine cellar room in the basement, had not been secured. John Ramsey's understandable, but forensically damaging, act of picking up his daughter's body and carrying her upstairs further altered the scene, potentially disturbing the position of the body and scattering or moving evidence crucial to understanding the immediate circumstances of her death. This action, while born of a father's grief, unfortunately added to the challenges faced by the forensics team when they finally had a homicide scene to process. The impact of this contamination cannot be overstated. In any criminal investigation, the ability to collect, preserve, and analyze forensic evidence without contamination is paramount. Trace evidence, microscopic fibers, hairs, biological fluids, fingerprints can link a perpetrator to a victim or a scene. When a scene is contaminated, it becomes incredibly difficult to distinguish between evidence related to the crime and evidence introduced innocently by others. This made it significantly harder for investigators to build a clear picture of what happened and who was present, weakening the potential for conclusive forensic links. Beyond crime scene contamination, critics also pointed to a perceived lack of experienced and technically equipped staff within the Boulder Police Department to handle a complex homicide investigation of this magnitude. While local police departments handle various crimes, a high-profile child murder with peculiar characteristics like a ransom note and potential staging requires specialized expertise in areas like forensic analysis, psychological profiling, and managing intense media and public pressure. The text alludes to challenges with the initial investigation and suggests errors were made, implying that the department may not have been fully prepared for the unique demands of this case. Another point of criticism mentioned in the text was the alleged sharing of evidence with the Ramseys. While details are sparse in the provided information, The idea that investigators might have shared specific details about the case or the evidence with individuals who were also considered suspects is highly problematic. Sharing information could potentially allow a guilty party to tailor their statements, alibis, or behavior to fit the known evidence, making it harder for investigators to uncover the truth. In a case where staging was suspected, sharing details could be particularly detrimental, potentially reinforcing the perpetrator's fabricated narrative. Furthermore, the delay in conducting formal, recorded interviews with John and Patsy Ramsey in the immediate aftermath of the discovery was also criticized. While preliminary interviews were conducted, the Ramseys, on the advice of their legal counsel, delayed submitting to more in-depth, formal questioning. While they had the right to legal representation, the delay in obtaining detailed accounts from the parents, who were the only other adults known to be in the house, in the critical hours and days after the crime was seen by some investigators as a missed opportunity. Fresh memories are often the most accurate, and delays can allow for conscious or unconscious alteration of recollections. The fact that their formal interviews occurred months after JonBenét's death, as mentioned in the text, highlights this delay. These initial errors, the compromised crime scene, potential limitations in specialized expertise, the alleged sharing of evidence, and the delayed formal interviews created an uphill battle for investigators from the very beginning. They complicated the analysis of physical evidence, made it harder to assess the reliability of witness accounts, including those of the Ramseys, and fueled public and internal disagreements about the direction of the investigation. The impact of these early missteps resonated throughout the entire investigation. They made it challenging to definitively support either the family member or the intruder theory based solely on the initial evidence, as elements that might have supported one theory could be explained away by the compromises made at the scene. The lack of a clear, uncompromised starting point meant that every subsequent piece of evidence and every interview would be viewed through the lens of these initial failures, adding layers of doubt and complexity. In conclusion, while the JonBenét Ramsey case is a tragic story of a young life lost, it also serves as a stark case study in the critical importance of the initial response to a major crime. The errors made in the early hours of December 26, 1996, as outlined in the provided text, including the failure to secure the crime scene, the perceived lack of specialized resources, and the handling of interviews, undoubtedly contributed to the decades of unresolved questions and the enduring mystery surrounding who killed JonBenét Ramsey. These missteps serve as crucial lessons learned, hopefully informing law enforcement responses to future tragedies. Here on Silent Shadows, we've delved deep into the haunting case of JonBenét Ramsey, a tragedy that unfolded on Christmas morning, 1996, forever altering the landscape of true crime and captivating the world's attention. We've explored the vibrant, brief life of a child beauty queen, the affluent world she inhabited, and the horrifying discovery that shattered her family and community. We've dissected the perplexing evidence found at the scene, the bizarre ransom note with its unusual demands and language, the chilling details revealed by the autopsy, the physical clues like the garrote, the duct tape, and the debated blueprint. We've examined the crucial, yet complicated, role of the unknown male DNA, the scientific breakthrough that led to the exoneration of the Ramsey family by the district attorney's office, but whose true source and significance are still subjects of intense debate among experts. We've navigated the stormy seas of the investigation itself, marked by conflicting theories that pitted family against intruder, highlighting the controversial handling of the initial crime scene and the deep divisions that emerged among the investigators and legal officials tasked with finding justice for JonBenét. We've seen how the relentless glare of the media shaped public perception, fueled speculation, and led to heated legal battles over reputation and truth. We've even touched upon the strange interlude of a false confession, a bizarre footnote in an already unbelievable story. Through it all, one truth remains stark and undeniable. JonBenét Ramsey's murder is unsolved. The questions that arose in the first hours of December 26, 1996, continue to echo today. Was it a random intruder, a predator who slipped into the Ramsey home under the cover of darkness? Or was it something far more tragic and intimate, a crime committed by someone within the family circle, followed by a desperate attempt to conceal the truth? Decades have passed since JonBenét's innocent life was taken. The initial leads have gone cold, the physical evidence has aged, and memories have faded. Yet, the case endures, a persistent mystery that continues to fascinate and frustrate. The Boulder Police Department maintains an active investigation, holding on to the hope that new technologies, particularly in DNA analysis, or a new piece of information could finally reveal the identity of the killer and bring some measure of closure to this enduring tragedy. The story of JonBenét Ramsey is a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence, the destructive power of secrets, and the often elusive nature of justice. It's a case that challenges our assumptions, exposes the flaws in investigations, and leaves us contemplating the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. What do you believe happened to JonBenét Ramsey? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into a cold case compelling, please give this video a like and share it with others who are fascinated by true crime mysteries. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Silent Shadows for more gripping short documentaries that unravel the mysteries behind true crime cases from around the world. Thank you for listening. Join us next time on Silent Shadows as we continue to shed light on the darkest corners of justice, one story at a time.